Hello guys, welcome to Development Economics. This is lecture 3 and today we're going to talk about history of thought in development economics, or how basically the ideas of how the country should develop um, evolve in time. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through the whole history and all the impacts, and for that you have a separate course called History of Economic Thought. That's to a large extent is important. What we're gonna focus on is first what historical events and what historical ideas still accurate, they still contribute to our vision of what is development and how to reach that developed state. And here again, we have events and we have ideas. Let's talk first about events. So to a large extent, we're gonna skip all the history up to Second World War, with only one exception. So this exception is British Empire, particularly British Empire, and other colonization, French one, but mostly British Empire, because still, even now, there are economists that work and they try to prove that the main reason why countries like Canada and Australia and even United States are developed is because they were part of British Empire. So, well, again, no one knows exactly the truth. This argument has partial truth. So if you study detailed the research, the arguments they propose is that the culture, the business culture, the financial support, the trade patterns, they were developed to a large extent within this British Empire. So, and those countries like Canada and Australia in particular benefited a lot from that part of, that process in British Empire. However, we have India, which is a developing country and quite underdeveloped with a lot of poverty. So you can't say again, as I said in the first lecture, for any claim there is always a counterfact that you can say, well, this country wasn't that successful, so it's not true. However, that's how the situation is. And one of the major problems in research in all, and in particular in development economics, is that we don't know what we call a counterfactual. The history has only one line. It has something has happened. That's what we have, the data. We don't know what would Canada look like if it wasn't a part of British Empire. So of course we cannot answer what is the impact of that fact that Canada was a part of British Empire. And the next week we're going to dedicate entirely to what is called impact evaluation. So this is a major part of development economics, and in particular, if you take our graduate level course 600, development, with a pretty much same name, development economics, the whole course is entirely focused on impact evaluation and goes deep to statistics. So you need to program in Stata or R the data and use the different methods. So we're going to talk about that next week, but you can see why it's important even right now talking about history. Something happens, has an impact. Each event, each process, what is nowadays more relevant is World Bank programs. So there is a program to stop poverty. How successful is the program? To understand that, unfortunately, again, very hard, because we don't know what would happen if the program was not in place. Maybe the situation was worse, well, reasonably to believe, but what is particular impact of this program and how you compare different programs, that's all quite a challenge. And again, we're going to spend the whole week focusing on different methods and approaches to this type of problem. In terms of history, for us, again, that's before the Second World War, The only impact that is kind of still lasting that we can affect right now is the part of empire. So the British Empire is the most important in this case because we have Canada and Australia, one of the most developed countries, and they kind of claim, so those examples show that it was nice and beneficial to be a part of British Empire. Again, far not all British colonies are that successful, so that argument it's not absolute. About French Empire, again, they are not that successful, so this theory is not that important. On the other hand, still what we have now, as Canada and Australia have some financial relationship and trade relationship with UK. And if you see the trade maps, sometimes you see there is a geographical most, like number one reason for trade is geography. You trade with your neighbors. That's rule number one. But number two is actually this historical pattern. And you see that Australia trades, for example, way more with UK than with Germany, or even with a country that is closer, like Africa, African countries. So you see those trade maps, and you see the strict pattern that it is true that British colonies, they tend to have financial relationship with London, with United Kingdom. And London actually is the second largest financial center after New York. So and it's a world financial center. If New York is the largest, but it is mostly focused on US assets, London is not focused on UK assets. It's an international center, international money market for the whole world. So Japan, Latin America, Australia, they all trade in London at particular financial instruments and currencies. But also that all evolved from historical trade patterns. So that is pre-Second World War important notice. Why Second World War and after that is important? Because pretty much during the Second World War, all the world structure was destroyed. We had empires before that had some relationship between each other. During the Second World War, that was completely destroyed. And after Second World War, we had more what is known like an institutional driven development. So after Second World War, we had United Nations were formed as an institution to facilitate at least discussion in the first place and cooperation between the countries to avoid the Third World War, and it's still the goal. So instead of having a global wars and conflicts, there was created a place where countries and their representatives can negotiate their problems and ideally help each other. So under United Nations umbrella, institutions like World Bank and IMF were established, as well as World Trade Organization. So World Trade Organization promotes free trade. We're gonna get to that in a bit in one of the further lectures. Free trade and economic development. What is for us more important that World Bank was created and IMF. IMF is its role is to balance financial flows, and originally it was a really complicated goal, because if you studied financial system or one of the courses related to financial system before, you should know that before Second World War, essentially we had a gold standard. Gold was a global money, and it was way easier than we had after Second World War, and definitely easier than we have now, because gold has a value on its own. A piece of gold, no matter whose portrait is on that, had a value. After Second World War, due to war itself and also growth, so even before the Second World War, we had a financial crisis due to this not really working monetary system. So after Second World War, we established that we will have a paper money, which is an obligation of the central banks of each country. So within the country, it's kind of enforced by the government and the system that itself, so it's more or less clear how it operates. However, how you trade with other countries, that's a bit a difficult thing. You have your own currency, US has dollars, Europe has euro. How are you going to trade? And for that, if you buy constantly from Europe, they don't want dollars, they don't need dollars, and you don't need euro. What are you going to trade? So for that reason, there was IMF created that will be, idea is like a central bank for the central banks, so they can facilitate this institution, this trade. So basically, originally, again, right after Second World War, that process was quite complicated. Before electronic transfers, that was actually a physical money, and that is a hell of a job to do. You need, if you trade from US to Europe with a physical, even paper, but it's a physical money. So that IMF could be like a bank. So you can make some transfers to the IMF, and then IMF will be like a clearinghouse. So that was a story behind the IMF. That's not particularly relevant to our course in detail. So that's a financial money market course, but it's very important for development as well. What is directly relevant is the World Bank. World Bank mission is to promote development. So it's a kind of place, institution where developed countries that are successful already contribute some money and enforce some programs to support developing countries. And we're gonna study also in future the basic, again, this is, as economists, you already know how development works, as I mentioned first works. So for economics, the kind of fundamental view, you invest money, you create something, you get return, and you develop. That's the only way. And why it is important, let's say, for United States to think of developing countries in addition to basic like humanism. It is important because United States and any other developed country, especially I guess US and Japan and Germany, very developed countries, highly developed, they have a lot of money. They have tons of capital, and remember the capital, the amount of capital, the demand for capital is measured by interest rate. So the lower the interest rate, this means you have too much capital. And again, we used to have zero interest rate, which is ridiculous from theoretical point of view, and there are really important impacts of that on economic science. We had zero interest rate for 8 years, and just recently we had a first hike made by Federal Reserve. So what it means that developed countries have a lot of capital, and this idea of investing in somewhere and getting return, there is nowhere to invest. And if you physically, yeah, you can see, well, we still have homeless people in Hawaii, we don't have enough housing, we have plenty of things to invest, but that's why we study. We go deeper in financial system, and in reality, you realize that unfortunately it's misbalanced, it's a lot of problems, but the fact is it had, as a country, US has a zero interest rate, means it doesn't get it doesn't have anything to invest. It's just like you have tons of money and nothing generates you income. That's reality. And the developing countries have the opposite problem. They have usually tons of people, everything is cheap because they don't have any capital. And still, why is that? It's a very long process to understand and to study why it happened. But the most important for us is think not why it happened, but what we can do. And one of the major lectures here will be dedicated to what is called foreign direct investment, FDI. That is the fundamental economic driver of development for developing countries. So the idea is that, well, US has tons of money, zero interest rate, let's say Ukraine or Vietnam, Indonesia, any developing country, the interest rate is like 10, 20, sometimes even 30%. Well, normally it's around, well, it's not, again, normal, because unfortunately all the countries is like in constant crisis. So this average rate is around 15 to 25%, and that's way above the zero. So you can get 15% investing in Ukraine and Vietnam, or maybe even 30% actually return, while you get zero in the United States, or close to zero. This is a benefit for US investors. Instead of keeping money where everyone has money, US, Germany, Japan, there's no way to invest. No one needs money. You put money where they really need it. Then you get your return. You borrow money to those countries, or in case of direct investment, you actually invest not just money, you invest human capital, your knowledge of business, your knowledge of experience, how to be developed country. So you invest there, and then you get feedback, and that works. That's how business works. That's how rich people get rich, at least some of them. And that particularly is a creating of value. So that's a very fundamental and important process. And so again, coming back, after Second World War, this World Bank was created to support this idea. So they realized, and it's still going on, they realized that, well, for US business owner, an investor to go to, I don't know, let's say, same Ukraine or Vietnam, that's a bit of a challenge. However, if there will be such institution as a World Bank with under United Nations umbrella, very kind of important with a good sound name, that can influence, let's say, Ukrainian government in a way like protect those investments, to establish some rules, to provide also capital to some projects, to reduce poverty, reduce crime, promote security, law enforcement, then US investors will have more incentive. They will be safer to invest in developing countries. And so the World Bank basically acts as a like first and the riskiest investor. It goes to the projects that are really, they might not pay back in terms of risk. So, building schools in the rural area of India is most likely is not a profitable business, but it's very important, and it creates those educated people who now can be of interest for private investors. So that can drive the Indian economy up. That stays behind this fundamental idea. So the World Bank is kind of key, not the key element, but it's the first element, one of the important elements, not the most important, but it's a very important element in this process. So we're going to study again this process, very important in detail in future with data and particular cases. For now, just want to understand that Second World War, United Nations, in particular World Bank, that is the milestone that created the world we live in. It created the institutions that supported, even though it was almost 80 years ago. So since that, it's kind of going on the same path. There were no dramatic changes. One dramatic change was a technological revolution, which made all these things like investments, traveling easier. So even though it didn't change fundamentally, like Second World War completely destroyed the old system and basically the new system appeared. The technological revolution didn't do that, but it made things way easier, like 100 times easier. Before, you can imagine, you'd say, well, Vietnam needs money, they can produce nice clothes, But imagine doing that 50 years ago. You need to personally go there, even though, again, you have planes, but flying wasn't that fun and easy as nowadays. Then you have to move a physical amount of money. Again, what is money in that time? Hard to understand. Vietnam doesn't need your US dollars, and you need you need some gold, or a lot of complications at that time. So when you have it, just click on your computer, you can do that. Imagine how fast and easy it became. It indeed changed dramatically, but not fundamentally. So the structure didn't change, it just became easier. And global trade increased and so on. So companies like Amazon, Google facilitate that. That's a second major twist, major important thing that happened during the last 80 years and influence what we have now. So yeah, pretty much that's what I want you to know about history. So again, we have tons of small events and important things that we have, but that's a two major things. So the most important is the Second World War, and then we have before that we had these empires, in particular British Empire and their impact. And recently, relatively, we had a technological revolution that make this investment and cooperation easier. One more point related to this history is called theory of convergence. So this is related to an idea whether developing countries, where they should go, how they should converge to developed countries. And this is a very popular topic to discuss, whether they actually will ever be developed and whether it's a step-by-step process. So for a long time it believed that it's a step-by-step process. And recently we realized that not, again, because of technological revolution, and it make the things like you can skip the process of some steps of development and jump from the being in a jungle and somewhere in the middle of Africa with 200 years old technology. You can jump to having internet and teaching your kids to use computers. That's what happening in Africa. And so this means that you don't have to go kind of the same path. However, still there is a long debate how and whether it is possible to converge and kind of reach for developing countries to reach the level of development. We will study some successful stories. We have Asian tigers, and we have Chile, which is one Latin America country, and we have Eastern Europe countries that managed to do that. So they were developing, and then they jumped to developed. Well, in case of Eastern Europe, it's a bit different because they call it transitional countries, like Czech Republic or even Ukraine. Those countries were developed before, but then they were influenced by the communist ideology, and they had a weird. So transitional countries, they didn't have market economy, but they have a lot of things we're talking about developed. Like there was no poverty, there were very good healthcare, more or less, and very good education. But they're low income, so we didn't have income. We had that some other things done. So the transition means you kind of try to reshape your economy, but it doesn't mean that you didn't have anything and then you try to build everything new, like in case of purely developing countries like Africa or Southeastern Asia. So, for example, for Czech Republic, it wasn't something like the jump wasn't something really radical, because Czech Republic, again, Ukraine, Poland, Eastern European countries, they were, 100 years, 200 years ago, they were already developed on the urge of, and throughout history, there were hard times, Second World War, and the communist control. That wasn't helpful, but a lot of things were already in place. So, as particular healthcare, education, those things are very hard to build. So, because they were in place, some countries more successful, some countries less successful, but the transition happened quite fast. So, in 20 years, uh, countries like Czech Republic and Poland, they reach almost the level of developed countries. And well, that's a topic of convergence. So there is this theory whether we can converge or we cannot do that, and a lot of issues related to that. We're gonna talk about it in time to time. So that's it for the history. Good luck.